When most people think of trains, they picture punctual commuter services or cultural icons like the Orient Express. What they don't imagine are the failures, bizarre contraptions so badly designed they rattled themselves apart, experimental prototypes that looked like props from a sci-fi comic, and some of the worst trains in history that should never have made it onto the tracks. Today, we're not talking about the Flying Scotsman or the Shinkansen. We're diving into the failed trains, the iron follies, and the railway nightmares that belong more in the scrapyard than the record books. From jet-powered rocket cars to ghostly silver metros, these are the 10 trains that should never have run. And while this particular service is guaranteed to derail, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to us here at Tenfold Gold for more of history's strangest machines and misadventures. Number 1. The Cugnot Steam Wagon, 1769. Before railways had even been laid, French engineer Nicolas-Joseph Cugnot decided to reinvent transport with the world's first self-propelled vehicle. His creation, the Cugnot Steam Wagon, was supposed to haul artillery pieces without horses. What rolled out of his workshop looked more like a kettle glued to a wheelbarrow. It had a giant copper boiler sticking out the front, a clumsy three-wheel frame, and a top speed that could be measured in walking pace. On paper, it was revolutionary. In practice, it was a barely controllable hissing monster. The steam wagon wheezed, lurched, and needed frequent stops to build up pressure. And in its most famous outing, it careered into a stone wall in Paris, making it arguably the world's first recorded vehicle crash. Cugnot's contraption never caught on. The French army quietly dropped the idea, deciding horses were safer, faster, and far less likely to explode. Yet the steam wagon survives in legend as the grandfather of trains and cars alike, a reminder that the first step towards progress often involves a spectacular stumble. Number 2. The Fireless locomotive. In the 19th century, engineers faced a tricky problem. How do you run trains inside factories, mines, and chemical plants without showering sparks everywhere? The solution, at least on paper, was the Fireless locomotive. Instead of carrying its own roaring firebox, it was charged up with steam from a stationary boiler, like a giant thermos flask on wheels. It sounded clever, but in practice, it was about as exciting as it looks. Fireless engines were slow, underpowered, and their steam charge ran out in no time. A normal locomotive could thunder down the line for hours. A fireless one might wheeze around the yard for a morning before needing a refill. Worse still, they were so heavy and clumsy that any supposed safety was often undone by their tendency to bump into things. They did see some limited use in niche industries, but for most railway companies, the fireless locomotive was more trouble than it was worth. Why bother with a glorified steam kettle on wheels when a small, well-designed tank engine could do the job better? Today, they're remembered less as bold innovations and more as the railway equivalent of a dead battery. Number 3. The Turbomotive, 1935. By the 1930s, British engineers were eager to prove steam still had life in it. Enter the LMS Turbomotive, an experimental express locomotive powered not by pistons, but by a steam turbine, the same kind of kit you'd expect in a power station or ship. The theory was enticing: smoother running, fewer moving parts, and a sleek futuristic image that might keep steam relevant in the age of diesel and electric. The reality? Less bullet train, more boiler room blunder. Turbines work brilliantly at steady high speeds, but railways are all about stopping and starting, climbing hills, and hauling uneven loads. The turbomotive guzzled coal like no tomorrow, struggled to accelerate, and wasted enormous amounts of energy every time it had to brake or crawl. Crews found it temperamental, passengers didn't notice much improvement, and accountants hated its appetite. After a decade of unimpressive service, it was quietly withdrawn and scrapped following wartime damage. The dream of turbine trains fizzled out, proving that while the idea was sleek on paper, in practice the turbomotive was a dead-end branch line in locomotive history. Number 4. The M497 Black Beetle jet train, 1966. In the swinging 60s, America was obsessed with speed. The space race was on, supersonic jets were in the skies, and someone at New York Central Railroad thought, Why not strap jet engines to a train? The result was the M497, nicknamed the Black Beetle, a standard diesel railcar retrofitted with two massive jet pods ripped straight off a bomber. It looked absurd and sounded even worse. When the engines fired up, it screamed down a straight stretch of track in Ohio at 183 miles per hour, shattering the U.S. rail speed record. For a moment, it seemed like the future of transport had arrived, the Jetsons on rails. But that future lasted about as long as the test run. The jet engines were horrendously loud, hideously fuel-hungry, and produced so much heat that they risked setting the trackside ablaze. And unlike planes, trains can't just climb into the sky to avoid obstacles. The Black Beetle was retired almost immediately, the engines unbolted and sent back to the Air Force. All that remains is a footnote in history, a train so desperate to be a plane, it forgot it had wheels. Number 5. The Benny Railplane, 1930s. In interwar Scotland, entrepreneur George Benny had a dream. Why not solve railway congestion by building another railway above the first one? His solution was the Benny Railplane, a suspended monorail designed to glide passengers in streamlined pods while freight trains rumbled below. Think of it as an early attempt at a double-decker transport network. The prototype looked like something out of Flash Gordon, a silver bullet-shaped carriage hanging from an overhead track, powered by whirring propellers at each end. Benny gave dazzling demonstrations, showing how his futuristic machine could whisk passengers along at 120 miles per hour. Investors and journalists were invited to marvel as the lone test track near Glasgow hummed into life. But dazzling demos don't pay the bills. The railplane required entirely new infrastructure that no railway company wanted to fund. The car itself carried only a handful of passengers, so it was never going to replace existing services. By the late 1930s, the track rusted away and Benny went bankrupt. Today, the Benny Railplane is remembered not as the future of rail travel, but as a spectacular dead end, a monorail before monorails were even cool. Number 6. The Brennan Gyro Monorail, 1909. British inventor Brennan had a vision of his own, trains that could balance perfectly on a single rail, even around sharp bends or up steep hills. His answer was the gyro monorail, a contraption that used massive spinning gyroscopes hidden inside the carriage to keep it upright. On paper, it was genius. In motion, it was more like watching a circus act. At exhibitions, crowds gasped as the ungainly machine trundled along, staying miraculously balanced on just one skinny rail. Brennan even demonstrated it, carrying dozens of passengers who must have trusted those whirring gyros with their lives. But there was a catch. If the gyroscopes ever stopped spinning, the whole thing toppled like a drunk on ice skates. Governments admired the novelty, but balked at the risks. What if the gyros failed mid-journey? What about points, junctions, or even a stiff breeze? Ultimately, nobody was brave enough to gamble on a railway where one mechanical hiccup could send the train sprawling sideways. The gyro monorail was quietly shelved, surviving only in photographs and a handful of models, a bizarre invention that proved balance is best left to tightrope walkers. Number 7. The Schienenzeppelin, 1930s. Leave it to the Germans to dream up a train that was basically half locomotive, half aircraft. The Schienenzeppelin was a sleek, streamlined railcar powered not by wheels or pistons, but by a giant wooden propeller bolted to the back. Designed by engineer Franz Kruckenberg in 1930, it looked like a Zeppelin gondola that had crash-landed on railway tracks. And unbelievably, it worked. In June of that year, the Schienenzeppelin rocketed down the line at 143 miles per hour, smashing the world rail speed record. It looked like the Germans had realized the dream that nobody else could manifest, a train that moved like a plane. But then the problems became obvious. The massive spinning propeller at the back was a serious safety hazard. One slip near the platform and you'd be diced like coleslaw. The single-car design carried very few passengers, and reversing the train was almost impossible. Engineers quickly realized that while it made for a flashy record setter, it was about as practical as strapping wings to a bus. By 1939, the prototype was scrapped, its engines repurposed for more conventional designs. The Schienenzeppelin remains a glorious but ridiculous reminder that just because something can run doesn't mean it should. Number 8. The atomic train proposals of the 1950s. The 1950s were the atomic age, when anything and everything was imagined with a nuclear reactor bolted inside. Cars, planes, even lawnmowers were floated as atomic-powered ideas. Trains, of course, didn't escape the madness. Both the USA and the Soviet Union toyed with the concept of a nuclear locomotive that could run forever without refueling. On paper, it sounded like a marvel of efficiency. No coal, no diesel, just endless clean power and the ability to cross continents without stopping. But then reality chugged in. Where exactly would you put the reactor? How would you shield the crew and passengers from lethal radiation? And what happens if the train derails? A boiler explosion is bad enough. A radioactive spill in the middle of Kansas or Siberia would be catastrophic. Prototypes were sketched and models built, but mercifully, none ever ran. The schemes were quietly shelved when people realized that mobile nuclear disaster on rails wasn't a great selling point. Today, the atomic train survives only in patents and Cold War concept art. Some ideas should just stay in science fiction. Number 9. The Silverpilen ghost train. Not every doomed train was a mechanical disaster. Some earned their place in legend. In Stockholm during the 1960s, a peculiar-looking metro train began making the rounds. Painted in bare, silvery aluminium instead of the usual green, it was a prototype never meant for full service. Locals nicknamed it Silverpilen, the Silver Arrow. But its strange appearance and occasional late-night test runs sparked rumors. Passengers whispered about an eerie supernatural train that appeared on empty platforms with no one driving, whisking away the unwary. Some said it stopped at Kimling, an unfinished ghost station on the outskirts of the city, where anyone who boarded would never return. Over time, stories grew of lost souls trapped aboard, destined to ride the Silverpilen forever. In reality, it was just a dull experimental train pressed into service when carriages were short. But the myth endured, and Silverpilen became Sweden's most famous ghost story on rails. Even today, Stockholm commuters joke nervously about seeing its gleaming shell on a deserted platform. Proof, perhaps, that sometimes the scariest trains don't crash or explode, they simply never let you get off. Number 10. The Great Eastern Railway Decapod, 1902, UK. By the turn of the 20th century, Britain's railways were under pressure. Electric trams were stealing passengers in the cities, and the Great Eastern Railway wanted to prove steam still ruled supreme. Their answer? The Decapod, a gargantuan locomotive thrown together in record time to impress the public and silence the critics. The name came from its 10 driving wheels, which made it look less like an advanced express engine and more like a rolling centipede. At a demonstration in 1903, the Decapod thundered out of the station, hauling a heavy train at a respectable speed. Railway bosses cheered, the newspapers gushed, and then the problems began. The Decapod was so monstrously heavy that it wrecked track work wherever it ran. Its oversized boiler devoured coal like a furnace in hell. And worst of all, it wasn't actually useful. It was built to show off, not to serve a schedule. After just a handful of outings, the mighty Decapod was stripped down and converted into a very ordinary, very boring freight engine. It stands today as a classic British bodge job, big, noisy, and impressive for about 5 minutes before everyone realized it had absolutely no point. And there you have it, 10 trains that should never have left the shed, let alone rattled their way into the history books. From jet-powered Beetles to gyroscope circus acts, from atomic daydreams to ghostly silver specters, each one proves that railways aren't always the steady, sensible workhorses we imagine. Sometimes they're disasters waiting to happen, and sometimes they're just plain daft. What's striking is the variety. Some were too ambitious, some too underpowered, others simply too weird for anyone to take seriously. Yet every one of them reminds us that progress is never a straight line. More often than not, it's a wobbly set of tracks leading to a dead end. If you enjoyed this ride through railway misadventures, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Tenfold Gold for more of history's strangest machines and missteps. And tell us in the comments, which of these doomed contraptions would you least like a ticket for?